Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. It's a beautiful sunny day in London, which is very nice. This is a paper that I am presenting, but it's a joint project by myself and Professor Kim Ryholt. It's a project that we are starting now, in which we are editing a series of astrological handbooks in Demotic. And through them, we are exploring the socio-cultural history of Greco-Roman Egypt and also the origins of astrological practices that we see during that period, but also beyond. So we're trying to use these handbooks in order to explore the origins of what we understand as Hellenistic astrology. So we're trying to move beyond just the edition into trying to learn as much as possible from these texts, and through the comparison, which is the theme of this conference, with materials in Greek and Latin that were already known. So without further ado, okay, all right. So in this analysis of the social cultural context of Greco-Roman Egypt, by means of the study of astrology, we have some very illustrious predecessors. One of them was Franz Cumont, and he wrote in 1937 what is now a classic, L'Egypte des Astrologues, in which through the analysis of a handbook that had been published recently, this Liber Hermetis, which is a handbook that is preserved in Latin, but is a translation of an original Greek. He decided to explore how the predictions that we get in these kinds of astrological handbooks can tell us about the historical context in which these texts were composed. One of the characteristics of these handbooks that we have, mainly in Greek and Latin, is that they are preserved in later copies. So it's sometimes difficult to try to elucidate when they were originally written and to which period they actually refer to, and they reflect in their contents. So I've selected some quotes. Okay, you can see my arrow there. I've selected some quotes that are especially interesting for the kind of research that we are doing in this project. So looking into the information that Cumont could get from the Liber Hermetis, he already posed a series of desiderata of how the development of the study of ancient astrology should go in order to try to get more information. And he said that once the research on these materials is more advanced, we will be able to distinguish the sources of these kinds of handbooks much better, and to determine when these were composed. And he already established that all the characteristics of these predictions seem to point to a composition period in the Ptolemaic times. The references, especially to the royal court, is not a royal court that is not in Egypt, like in Roman times, but with a present pharaoh. So it's obviously taking us to Ptolemaic Egypt, or perhaps even a little bit earlier to late period Egypt. So this was something that he already stated back then. And then in terms of the kinds of observations that we see in the predictions, how these ideas would be conceived, which kind of research would lead to the composition of these handbooks. This is something that we want to explore in our project as well. So this is reflecting this society, and through these handbooks, we can not only just learn about the history of astronomy, but also to learn a lot more about the concerns of these people. Obviously, when you get your horoscope cast and then you get a prediction, you are concerned about the things that happen in your daily life. So that's going to reflect on what were the main worries of Egyptian society at the time. And then just a little interesting detail is that this book was published in 1937. And in 1938, Axel Bolten, who was working with the papyri in Copenhagen, was going to meet with Cumont to discuss the astrological handbooks that he had already identified in the collection, which are the ones that we're working on now. But this meeting never happened. So Cumont could have learned about the kinds of materials that we are exploring before, but unfortunately, or fortunately for us, that didn't happen at the time. And just to explain a little bit that image that I have chosen there, I don't know if you can see it clearly. It's the cover of an astrological calendar. It dates to the last part of the 17th century. It was printed in Germany. And it's part of an interesting phenomenon. When we study these issues, we're also interested in the reception that they have had in later times. So in Germany, at the end of the 17th century, there was this movement of production of astrological almanacs that people would use a lot to try to predict what the weather is going to be like, just things of daily life, basically the concerns that we see in the handbooks. And these were made by 4 astrologers at the time. And the way he marketed these products was by presenting themselves as Egyptian astrologers. There were 3 Egyptian astrologers and 1 Persian. And the one that you can see there, the astrologer called himself Necho of Al-Cairo, so of Cairo. And it's interesting that Pharaoh Necho, so Necho II, is one of the figures that are claimed as one of the figures of astrology, Necho and Osiris. So it's interesting to see that in Germany at the end of the 17th century, we still have this authorial attribution to give them pedigree. Another one that I didn't put there is a Sibylla Ptolemaion, who claimed to be the wife of Ptolemy, the great Ptolemy, the astrologer. Which is interesting. You might think, oh, there's also this female astrologer. No, it was a guy called Gottfried, but he just thought that this was a good way of marketing it. But, you know, it's just a little detail to see how all these attributions that we see in ancient times to give this pedigree to the astrological handbooks were already being used, were still being used in Germany in the 17th century. It's a little detail. The other great figure in the study of ancient astrology is Father Festugier. In his massive work, Revelation of Hermes Trismegistus, the first book is devoted to astrology. And he cites Cumon here, and he follows along those same lines. And I've also selected some quotes that are relevant for us. So one of the questions that he's asking is about what would be the contents of these books of Hermes, Hermes as the Egyptian thought, from which the other handbooks that we have later on derive. He also gives this date, again, following Cumon, of the 2nd or 3rd century BCE for the original composition of these handbooks. Again, we don't have anything from that period for the Greek materials. And also talking about the Liber Hermetis, there's this connection with the Hermetica from the more philosophical point of view. And I will go back to this in a moment. So in terms of this Hermetic original, again, he is remarking how this is very interesting, not just for the study of astrology, but to learn about the society of Ptolemaic Egypt. So this is basically from where we are departing and where we can go a little bit beyond what is possible to know just looking at the Greek and Latin handbooks. So moving a little bit closer to our time, this is a quote from an Encyclopedia of Ancient Natural Scientists. It's a short entry by Alexander Jones on Hephaistion of Thebes. So we're moving from the Liber Hermetis to another ancient astrologer. Hephaistion lived at the end of lived during the fifth century, and I've highlighted this second part of the entry because it's very important for what we're doing here. Alex says here that for the study of the history of Greek astrology, there are 2 particular chapters in the work of Hephaistion, and I will give you a little bit more background on Hephaistion in a moment, but I want to highlight this. He emphasizes 2 chapters in book 1 of Hephaistion's treatise, the Apotelesmatica, 21 and 23, in which Hephaistion summarizes the methods that he attributes to the old Egyptians, and he gives his sources. And these relate to the prognostications based on the eclipses, the comets, and especially the rising of Sirius, which is a very Egyptian concept. The rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the year in Egypt. And so it was a very important event in the calendar. It also coincided ideally with the flood of the Nile. Then the calendar moved later on. So keep those two numbers in mind, 21 and chapters 21 and 23, and we will go back to them. So who is Hephaistion of Thebes? We actually know very, very little about his life, but we know the details of his birth, and this makes sense. We're talking about astrology, so the date of birth is fundamental. And we could even say, well, if you know the date of birth, why do you need to know anything else? You can just get it from it, just cast the horoscope, and there you have it. So we have his date of birth because he uses it to explain how you calculate the date of conception. So we even know the hour in which Hephaistion was conceived, second hour of the night of the 20th of February of 380 CE, presumably. The important thing for us is that we have the treatise that he wrote, which is called the Apotelesmatica, composed in the early 5th century. It is a treatise in 3 books, and we also have 4 epitomes that summarize some parts of the treatise, and that we need to look at in combination with the main text, because there are several elements that we will find in them that are not in what we would call the main text. As I was saying, the problem with this kind of treatises is that the earliest copies that we have are actually pretty late. Here in History of Transmission, I've listed the main manuscripts that we have for Hephaistion. So for the main text, there are these 3 manuscripts, 2 in Paris and one is this Laurentianus, which is the oldest one. But notice that the oldest that we have for Hephaistion is 11th century. That's the oldest manuscript. And then the other 2 are from the 13th century. For the Epitome 4, which is the one that is going to be more interesting for us today, all the manuscripts are from the 14th century. So again, from the 5th century in which Hephaistion is writing until the 11th century, we have a long time in which this text has been copied, and obviously in each copy, there are modifications that are being affected to the text, abbreviations, errors, etc. So this is going to create difficulties for us to learn what the original text was. The edition of Hephaistion's work was made by Pingree in the 70s, and I'm copying the stemma that he has in his edition here, just to give you an idea of what we are dealing with. So we have the archetype here, which wouldn't be exactly what Hephaistion wrote, but the closest thing. And then you can see that the Laurentianus, the 11th century manuscript, is the closest that we have to that source, but it doesn't have the complete work. So for example, the part of book 1 that I'm going to be talking about today, which is the first chapter of book 1, is not preserved in that manuscript, so we can't access it through that source. You can see that the other 2 manuscripts for the main text come from this gamma source, which is further away from the archetype than the beta source. So using the Epitome 4 is also going to bring us a little bit closer in some parts to what the original text was. So we need to combine all these sources, but still we are not getting that close to the main source. All right, so what are the sources that Hephaistion was using in his treatise? There are 2 sources that have been explored in detail, and Pingree already in his edition identifies all the fragments that go back to these sources. One of them is Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. He talks about the divine Ptolemy and gives reference to his work. Obviously, this was the main treatise of astrology at the time. And also the poem of Dorotheus of Sidon, which is basically lost. We preserve it especially through Arabic copies. And he gives the reference to when he's using these sources. So he credits his sources. But we also have an explore sources. If we read through the text, and here I'm just focusing on book 1, we have many references throughout the work to the ancients or the ancient Egyptians. And if you look at where these references, these are all the references in book 1. If you look at where they are condensed, you see that we have 2 in the introduction, where he is presenting where his work is coming from. So that makes sense. Then most of them are in book 1, and then in books 21 and 23. Remember that entry by Alex saying that those were 2 chapters that were especially interesting with that connection with Egypt. But not just those 2 chapters, but also the first chapter. So if we explore these chapters, we will see if these are just attributions for, as Festugier used to say, exotic decor, or if there's some truth behind these references. Again, as in the 17th century Germany, it was a way of giving more legitimacy to these works, to attribute them to Hermes Trismegistos, to the ancients. The more ancient the knowledge is, the more creditable it was at the time. So we will need to judge if we trust him or not. Hephaistion, unfortunately, hasn't received a lot of attention in the study of astrology, but there have been some instances in which he has been quite important. One of them is this one that you see here. Neugebauer in the 40s published an article on Demotic horoscopes, and he explores several sections, several elements of these horoscopes, and one of them is the use of symbols. And you know that for the zodiacal signs, for the planets, we nowadays use a series of symbols that we can trace back to manuscripts, and Neugebauer did that in that article, to Byzantine manuscripts. And he was asking, could we take it further and take these symbols into antiquity? Unfortunately, through the Greek sources, this is difficult to do, but he was able to do it at least for one of the signs, and this is the sign for Libra. What I'm giving you on the top of the screen is Pingry's edition of Epitome 4, and this is interesting because it doesn't appear in the main text. We only find this bit in the Epitome. This is why it's important to look at all of them at the same time. And here in the beginning of the section for Libra, so it's the sign that comes after Virgo, and he says that a symbol was used by all the ancients, right? And he gives us the symbol. And here I can show you the two of the main manuscripts for this epitome, so that you see, apart from the edition, you see how it is written there. We even have it in the margin, a nice rubric. And he says that that was the symbol used by the ancients, and also that Ptolemy used it with the Greek he sign on top, distinguishing the two terms for the sign, so the balance and also the clause of the scorpion. But the interesting thing here is that we have this symbol, and if we compare it to the astrological handbooks, we see that in the handbooks we have the sign for the horizon, but it's a very similar sign. And the key here is that we don't just have the Byzantine manuscript, but this is a reference to Hephaistion. So we have the link in the 5th century for the transmission of this sign. Unfortunately, we don't have that connection for the other signs. And just as a little preview, I'm actually working on this topic right now with Stephanie Rudolph, who is a specialist in Syriac astrology. And we are looking into the transmission of these symbols, not through the Byzantine tradition, but through the Syriac one. And in the Syriac tradition, we are being able to show that continuity. So, that we will publish that in some time, because we're still getting all the manuscripts. But it looks like the demotic symbols, these demotic abbreviations for the zodiacal signs are at the origin of these symbols. We just need to be able to prove it through the manuscripts. Most of those Syriac manuscripts are not even published. So this is why that material is just not even available. So we are in the compilation state. But this is the important thing here, is that bringing all these sources together is actually letting us know a lot more about these transmissions. So here, Hephaistion came to save the day and provide us some evidence about these symbols. But otherwise, his work hasn't been so explored, really. Okay, we're moving away from Hephaistion for a moment, and we need to see what these demotic astrological handbooks are that I was mentioning. This is an updated summary of what we have at the moment, updated from last month. So, because it keeps changing as you explore the collections. So we have two types of astrology represented in the handbooks. One is mundane astrology, astrology that refers to the country, to the king, and personal astrology for individual people. And within personal astrology, we have two types of handbooks. Handbooks that have a focus on the houses. So this division of the sky that takes into consideration the horizon, and then it's basically two sets of coordinates with the side where the celestial bodies rise, where they set, and then the top of the sky where it's in midheaven, and then lower midheaven under the earth, and then a division of 12 sections using these coordinates. And also personal astrology with a focus on the decans. And this is quite interesting because the concept of the decans is an Egyptian concept that we find already in the Middle Kingdom. And at the moment of with Greco-Roman Egypt, when the zodiac is incorporated from Mesopotamia, the decans, which mark the passing of time through their rising, and you could calculate the time at night, for example, and the time in the year in which you were, are going to be merged with the zodiac. So they're going to represent sections of 10 degrees within each one of the signs, which was 30 degrees. This is where that Greek name decan comes from, those 10 degrees. So this original Egyptian concept is going to survive into later astrology through this incorporation with the zodiac. So what do we have? Mundane astrology is the one that is represented with more manuscripts. This is from Teptunis. So we're focusing on one side because it's the side from where we're getting most of these materials. We have around 40 papyri, of which 10 of them are manuals. So treatises that give you all the possibilities that you can check whatever is happening in the sky. You're going to be able to check what it means in that manual. And the rest of them are excerpts. So excerpts for particular years. Now, mundane astrology is Sophist divination, is based on the rising of the star Sirius, so the star Sophist. So when the star rises for the first time, you look at the sky, and whatever the celestial configuration is the horoscope for that year. So it gives you the prediction of what is going to happen in that year. So these excerpts are technically horoscopes of the world. And the earliest of them is what we call the Thema Mundi. So the horoscope that existed, the celestial configuration that existed in the moment of creation, so the birth chart of the world. This is what we have depicted, for example, on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera. We have two different configurations, but what we have here is different horoscopes for each one of the years at the birth of Sophis. So they're the horoscopes of the star Sirius, and these are about 30 papyri, and you can see how these would be very important because they will give you the prognostication for what is going to happen in the year. Then for personal astrology, the ones for the houses are 10 papyri, and they're not very well preserved, so it's still not clear how many types of handbooks, because we have here represented, because in many cases it is actually the same handbook, but preserved with variations, so summarized in some parts with additions from here and there, and at the moment it's hard to tell. Then we have personal astrology based on the decans. Here we have 9 papyri, and they're quite interesting. 8 of them have the same format, and in this case we have something that we don't have in other contexts, which is a division between men and women. Different handbooks that give different predictions depending on if they are the birth of a man or a woman. We do have evidence of this practice in other kinds of divination. For example, the Book of the Gecko, which gives you predictions depending on where a gecko falls on your body. So you're lying in bed, and if a gecko falls on your right shoulder, then this is what is going to happen. And there we have a handbook that just basically mentions body parts of a woman. So we assume that there might be equivalent handbooks for men, but we just don't have them. In this case, the interesting thing is we do have the ones for men and the ones for women, which gives us a very nice case study into gender roles at this point. So for the same thing, what were the predictions that were given for a man or a woman? It tells you what the expected roles for each gender would be in this society. So this is a very interesting point in terms of the study of these manuals. And then there's one papyrus that has a different format, which is still being studied. So just to sum up what we have around 85 Demotic astrological papyri in Thebes, which is quite a lot. It gives us an impression also of how important this kind of practice was in the Temple of Thebes, and perhaps we can extrapolate to other regions. 40 of them, as I was saying, are Sothis texts, 10 are manuals, and the rest are these excerpts, these horoscopes of Sothis. 10 personal divination based on the houses, 9 personal divination based on the decans, so it's more or less balanced. 12 are personal divination that we still don't know what it is about. Again, they're very fragmentary. Some of them are uniquely attested, so it's hard if you don't have comparanda. And then the rest are not classified yet. So again, little pieces here and there. At the moment, they're all assigned. They're in different degrees of study, and some of them are very advanced. They're probably going to be published in the next years. Once they are, we're going to be able to learn a lot more about this context of the practice of astrology. At the moment, very few have actually been published. So this is where we are. And in order to progress here, we have created a new project that is going to focus on the decanal handbooks. And this is something that Kim and I are doing now, and we will be doing for the upcoming years. So just to give you an idea, just focusing on these ones, we have, as I said, 6 handbooks devoted to prognosis for men and 2 for women. Of those 6, and this is an important feature, 5 come from within the temple precinct in Thebes, and they date to the 2nd century BCE. Most of the materials from this find the so-called Thebes temple library date to that period. When we talk about temple library, the way these papyri were found was, and I will show you a map later on, was within the temple precinct, but in one of the houses that are in the temple precinct, in a cellar, in 2 cellars in a house. What we don't know is if that was the original place where they would be kept, or if they were taken there at some point when the temple was abandoned. When we think of temple libraries, we can imagine that the books that were used normally in the cult would be available within the temple. If you think of the Temple of Edfu, in that little closet library that is in the hypostyle hall, but the bulk of the library was perhaps kept somewhere else, and then just books brought when they needed to be used, especially archival copies that wouldn't be used constantly. So 5 are from this find within the temple precinct, and 1 is from the rubbish dump, which is outside the temple. The texts that come from the rubbish dump are significantly earlier, and this papyrus is from the 2nd century BCE. So we are a lot earlier. And this is really important because, as we were saying, the date of composition for these handbooks that we presume is the Ptolemaic period, but we didn't have any that dated to this period, except for this one. So I will give you some more details about this particular text. This is really interesting. And then we have these 2 handbooks for women, which Ling Xinjiang, who works at Georgetown University, is preparing for publication and should appear relatively soon, because she has been doing a lot of great work and is close to finishing the edition. And these 2 are from within the temple, so from the 2nd century CE. And the reason why I brought the Tabula Bianchini, apart from the fact that it's really beautiful, is to show this dichotomy of handbooks for men and women, because what we have in the Tabula Bianchini is a double zodiac circle, and this could be used to determine compatibilities when 2 people were getting married. So in that case, you would use these handbooks to determine the fate of the people after showing the configuration on the board, which is interesting. We're starting to see all the different dimensions of this practice in material terms with the actual objects, which is really exciting. So this handbook that I was mentioning, that is much earlier than the others, from the 2nd century BCE, is this papyrus from Tunis. It was found in the recent excavations. Kim has talked about it in some presentations. He presented this the Demotic conference in Würzburg, which was 2014, I think, around that time. He called it initially Tunis biographies, because at the time it was not clear what it actually was. As I said, it dates to the 2nd century BCE. And what we have is 2 decanal sections. So 2 sections attributed to a particular decan with the description of the predictions. They start with astrological information. So one who is born in this particular, so when this celestial body is here, so attributed to a particular decan, is not fully preserved. In this case, in the first case, we don't have it, but in the second one, we have that one who was born in the second Wehemet of Gemini. Wehemet are these stages, these decans. So you have, Wehemet is a step, right? Like a floor in a building. So within Gemini, we have 3 steps, one of each for each one of the 3 decans of Gemini. So it starts with that, and then it gives a description. He will do this, he will be married, he will have this number of children. But the interesting thing with this text is that it's a lot more detail in the predictions than the later handbooks. So perhaps, and this needs still more study, we are dealing here with the original handbooks that were compiled in a lot more detail, and then they were summarized later on with what we see in the handbooks from the 2nd century CE. But this is the only evidence that we have of these very early handbooks. The structure is the same that we have in the later ones. They are not biographies of people because they're written in the future. So they're not describing the life of someone who has lived, but what will happen to a person at this point. This is the same thing that we have in the later handbooks. So this is the switch from considering them biographies to actual astrological handbooks that give predictions, but they are composed like a biography. So if you read it, it looks like the life of a particular person. And the question is, if they were compiled through looking at the lives of people who had been born at that particular moment with that configuration. We have physiognomy in the end, like we do in the other astrological handbooks, but this is also much more detailed than what we have later on. It gives lots of details, birthmarks in parts that you don't see. So even things that wouldn't be obvious, like if you think of the census in Roman times that give some of these characteristics, here is much more than what you would see in the census, actually. The papyrus is a palimpsest. So it was written before with another text, but it was erased. And then we have Demotic on one side, and then the other side is blank. So it hasn't been reused on the recto. We have only some jottings on the recto. There's a Greek one and then a Demotic one that is written in the same hand as the verso. The verso is where we have the text. So very interesting text and a lot earlier. In terms of material aspects of these handbooks, we have a mix. There's not a consistent way of creating these handbooks. Some of them are written on new papyrus, others are reused, and we have Greek texts on the recto. So normally if they're reused, the Demotic text is going to be written on the verse of the papyrus. Some of them are administrative, some of them are unidentified because it's really hard to read. They're really damaged, which might also relate to when these texts were used, and that recto part might have gotten more damaged from the use. In terms of presentation and layout of the text, there's also a variety of ways of presenting it. We have some of them with very with guidelines and rules that organize the text in very clean boxes with sometimes double guidelines, sometimes, as you can see here, single guidelines, but there are others that don't have any guidelines at all. There's one that only divides the columns but doesn't create the full boxes. So again, even within the same temple, there was not a standard practice for how these are presented. And we have a series of rubra in the handbooks to help with the navigation of the text. Obviously, these were treatises that would be used you needed to find the information. So some of them have the headings written in red, the whole heading, others just the beginning, and others just use black ink. So again, there's a wide variety. We can't say this is how the handbooks were done, because even within the same library, we have a lot of variation. But it's interesting to compare them also with the Byzantine manuscripts and to see that you find those rubrics also in very similar places. So one wonders if that's something that is also transmitted from how these were presented in antiquity. To give you an idea of how these manuscripts are structured, I'm going to use P. Calsberg 66, which also has some fragments in other collections. A report on this text, which is the best preserved one, was published by Michel Chavot in 1992. And that diagram that you see there is the diagram that he published. The text has 9 columns, of which we have 4 that are pretty well preserved. So columns 1, 2, 3, and then column 6, which is the one that you see here. We have a significant part of the text preserved. And then since then, we have been able to identify more fragments in different collections. So we have 9 further fragments in Copenhagen, which are still unplaced. In Lille, we have 6 fragments. You see 2 here that Chavot was able to join, but we still have 4 that are not placed. And then 3 fragments that Joachim Quack identified in Berlin. We have been able to place 2, and then 1 is still, some of them are really small, so it's really hard to place them. But we have more to play with at this point. Another thing that Chavot said in that article, which is quite interesting, is that in the hand of this manuscript, which is not it's not Tebtuni's hand, but that doesn't mean that it was not found in Tebtunis. There was an exchange of manuscripts at that point. But he relates the hand with what we see in one of the main corpus of horoscopes in Egypt, which is the Narmuthis ostraca. You see a photo of one of them here. It is actually the second main corpus of Demotic horoscopes, because now Thebes is the main corpus of horoscope. We have now more than 50 ostraca, and more keep appearing in every archaeological campaign. This last campaign at Thebes found 5,800 ostraca, of which many of them are horoscopes. So we think that the number is going to increase. So Narmuthis was the main corpus, now it's the second. But the interesting thing here is that he connected the orthographies, especially if you look here for the celestial bodies with those that we see in Narmuthi. So for example, if you look at Saturn, it uses this square to represent the symbol. They're basically the same kinds of symbols. And one thing that I've noticed while I was working on this project with the abbreviations of the zodiacal signs is that these same symbols are used in the Sign and Tree Almanac in Berlin. And the interesting thing here is that we have the 3 stages of astrological practice now represented in what looks like, if not the same hand, perhaps the same school, because symbols are conventional. So the fact that they're using the same ones might indicate that there's a collection. So we have, on the one hand, the astronomical tables that give you the raw astronomical data, then the horoscopes that you compile by using the information in the astronomical tables, and then the handbooks that you use in order to interpret the horoscope. So we're being able to fill in all the connections for learning about the astrological practice at the time. So using still 66, what are the parts of these handbooks? So fortunately here we have the first column. So we do have the introduction of the handbooks, which gives us a date and an authorial attribution. And what it says is that it dated to a regnal year of Pharaoh Djoser. So we're going back to the Old Kingdom, and the attribution of the writing of the composition of the handbook is to Imhotep. So again, we're going back to this sage of ancient times, this claiming ancient wisdom to have been preserved here. Then we have 12 sections for each one of the zodiacal signs, and within each one of them, 3 sections for each one of the decans, plus, and this is very interesting, an interstice in between. So 3 decans, and then the part in between the 2 signs. Then we have the predictions, and they relate to, relationship with women, children, the way you're going to die, illnesses, prestige in life. So the things that would worry a person. This is for the men's handbooks. In the women's handbooks, we have a lot about childbirth, getting pregnant. So the main concerns, again, on that side. And an interesting feature is that all these predictions are nuanced by the action of the planet. So you have the main predictions, and then you have, but if Saturn is looking at this star, then this will happen. So if you had a good prediction, but then you have a planet that was considered evil, then that might turn to the wrong side. So either they mention the planets by name, or they say a good or a bad star. And that's interesting because we see that in the later handbook. So we also already see this practice here. And then we have in some of them physiognomies, which I didn't include here because 66 doesn't have them, and a list of years. So of critical years, and they're presented as a series. And then sometimes some predictions are discussed for them. So we're going to present some of the comparisons to show you a little bit how they relate to the Greek handbooks and to Hephaistion in particular. But first, I wanted to show you how these decanal chapters were considered already in antiquity as very crucial ones, very important ones. If we look at Hephaistion, we see that the decanal chapter is the very first one that appears. So it's placed prominently in his treatise. But in the Liber Hermetis, in the way it stands today, it is also the first part. Now, there is a discussion that the decans seem to have been mentioned before, so we don't know if there was something earlier, but it's pretty early in the treatise. And if we look at the Hermetica, so this would be the philosophical side, not this practical side of the handbooks. We have this discussion between Hermes and Tat, and they're talking about astrology, and Tat is asking Hermes, who is the master, to explain to him about the 36 decans. And what Hermes Thoth replies is that this may indeed be my principal teaching. So he's already qualifying knowledge about the decans in a very prominent way. So again, this fits with what we see in this treatises. This was a very important knowledge. Now, a little detail is that in the horoscopes, the decans are not mentioned. So we have a dissonance there. But in some horoscopes, and especially the early ones, the Athribis ones, you have longitudes. So even if you don't have the decan mentioned, if you have the longitude within the sign, you could tell the decan easily. But it's interesting that they're not mentioned. So let's go back to Hephaistion. Again, these are the attestations that I already showed you. So chapters 21 and 23 are very important. And Alex had already claimed this. Chapter 23 is the one about Sirius. And I'm not talking about the Sophist manuals, but Kim has been able to connect specific passages in Hephaistion to the Sophist manuals too. So he was using those manuals. But most of these attributions or these references to the ancients are in chapter 1, which is the decanal chapter. And why is this? Well, because Hephaistion was using these handbooks that we have here, and we can establish clear connections. So if we look at the introduction of the text, there we don't have many parallels because Hephaistion's introduction mainly refers to Ptolemy. It's just presenting what he's doing. The introduction is absent from Epitome 4, so we don't know if there were different introductions going on around. And in the Demotic handbooks, as I was saying, of which we have only 2 that present the introduction, we have this attribution to ancient wisdom. So authorial attribution to Imhotep, regnal year of Djeser, and then it describes the contents of the handbook. So it tells that is going to use the zodiac and the decans to present the information. It says which kinds of predictions, and it has a reference to physiognomy. And this is interesting because Introduction to 66 says that it's going to give ideas about physiognomy, predictions of the physiognomy of the individual, but then it doesn't in the treatise, which already tells us that there's a layer of compilation there that was removed. Epitome 4 doesn't have physiognomies either. So we could start questioning what the sources are. If we go to book 1, we see that we have this combination of sources, Ptolemy, Dorotheus, and the ancient Egyptians. And the sections that are attributed to the ancient Egyptians can be mapped to these handbooks. So again, it was not exotic decor in the case of Hephaistion. He was indeed using these handbooks. He attributes this origin to the part on the decans, but also to references to the terms, which are divisions also within each one of the zodiacal signs. You get the terms of a particular planet that is influencing a number of degrees. So he also gives the attribution there. In terms of the decanal part, Hephaistion first gives us the Egyptian names for the decans, and then has a formula introducing he who is born in a particular decan gives predictions. Hephaistion gives physiognomy in the main book. Critical years, as we have seen that we also have in the Egyptian handbooks, and he gives us this notion of the interstice in between the sign, which was considered unusual, but now we know that it's a concept that comes directly from the astrological handbooks. In terms of the formulae, we also see parallels. Hephaistion uses 2 main formulas to introduce the decanal sections, one from Aries to Gemini, and then another that starts in Cancer. And Joachim already noticed this dichotomy. I'm giving you Aries 1, which is the more elaborate, then he summarizes, but it's basically those who were born, those who have the first decan in the ascendant, then this will happen. For decans 2 and 3, you can see that he summarizes it a little bit. And then starting in Cancer, which is interesting, that's the sign for which the first decan is Sophist, is where you would start in Egypt. The formula changes, and he actually uses the one who is born in the first or second decan. If you look at the formula that we have in the Egyptian handbooks, that second formula is exactly a translation of what we have there. The one who was born in the first, second, third level of whatever zodiac sign. And then he gives you from degree this to degree this, which is unnecessary. But again, if the horoscopes are compiled with the degrees, there it gives you a hint. If you don't remember your decans, then you can look at it there. And then it gives another element. It gives the moon, when the moon is, and then there's a little bit of controversy about how we translate that term. I agree with Joachim in considering that it's in front of, that is in opposition, but not going to focus on that today because that would be just a lecture in itself. The formula to introduce the interstice follows the same pattern. So you can see here how Hephaistion presents that formula, the space in between the mesembolemas, how he calls it. It's called the interstice. And then in the Demotic handbooks, he who was born in Pawesh, Wesh is like the empty part, or like the space in between zodiac sign and zodiac sign. So again, this is a very direct translation of what we have in the handbooks. He is really working with these kinds of texts. For the intervention of the planets that I was mentioning, we also have very similar formulas. So in Egyptian, when he specifies, or when the handbook specifies the planet, we have, for example, here, if Saturn or Mars look upon. So there's this concept of looking, and then noticing Hephaistion, if Aphrodite, if Venus looks upon. So again, the same terminology, or good or bad stars. So if a good star is in, if a good star looks upon, and we have different verbs being used also in Egyptian. For the critical years, in the Demotic handbooks, they're designated as temech or temtem, and it's not clear exactly what the term means. Hephaistion uses climacteres for the critical years, but they're presented in the same way, and they're presented as being written, as being found in writing somewhere, both in Egyptian, so these temech which are written concerning him, and then year, and then number, and then in Hephaistion, and his critical years are registered, again, in writing as such. So again, very close translation. In terms of the physiognomies, Hephaistion introduces them as tasemeia, so his signs. In one case it's in singular, but I think that's just an error. It only appears once. But in epitome 4, as I was saying, they are absent. But there is a clue that they were there at some point, because in the third decan of Aries, you do have them. So, you know, there's a remain there of, they were not completely taken out, but we can see that there were handbooks with different levels of detail. So it was important probably to have different kinds of handbooks to find the information that you needed more easily, or depending on the kind of service that the temple was going to give, you need a more complex or less complex handbook. In the Demotic handbooks, we see them mentioned in the introduction, but omitted in 66 from the text. But then in others, we do have detailed physiognomies, and especially in that early handbook. So again, there's the same kind of variation. In terms of the predictions, we have tentatively identified some parallel sections. In the case of this early handbook, the one from the Rabishtam, we have this comparison with Hephaistion. So for the third level, Wehemed of Taurus, Hephaistion says, and they will come to have no enjoyment in natural intercourse. Now, if you read that, it's like, well, they're not going to enjoy sex. Okay, fine. And then in the physiognomy, one of the elements is that they will be pleasing of face, all right? If we look at the Demotic text, this is the important part of the comparison. The Demotic text it gives us more detail, so it might tell us what Hephaistion actually meant. So if we look at the description there, he says, or the handbook says, the man had no children with his first wife, lost his second wife during labor, and had no children with the third wife. He ended up adopting 5 children. So what Hephaistion might have meant is not that he's not enjoying sex, but he's not getting any fruits out of it, which would be probably the main concerns, just having an heir. So it's nuancing what we have in the Greek text. So this comparison is going to give us more insights into what we had. And then in the same section, he's pleasing of face, a very similar expression. So this is, in this project, what we want to map in a very detailed way to do all these comparisons. And then this gender dichotomy, as I said, there's no other type of divination for which we have examples of the 2 handbooks. And Hephaistion is written in the masculine, so it refers to predictions for men, except for 2 instances. In the interstices of Virgo and Sagittarius, again, that concept of the interstice that is very Egyptian in that way, we have these 2 parts. In Virgo, if she should be a woman, and then it gives you the predictions in the feminine. And in Sagittarius, if she is female. So He had access to the handbooks for women. He just didn't use them for this treatise, except for there. So again, we're being able to find this, and I'm getting to the end. Another very important thing of the study of these handbooks is that we do have the archaeological context for them. And this is crucial because for most papyri, they were sold in the black market, 19th century, and we don't know where they come from. Here we know exactly to which priestly community they were connected to. Here you can see, this is a plan of Tebtunis. You can see the temple precinct. This is where the rubbish dump is located. And then within the temple precinct, this house that you see there is where the two cellars were located, where the papyri, the Tebtunis temple library was found. And as I was saying, the dump, 2nd century BCE, and then the other handbooks are from inside the temple precinct. So you see that division and that separation in time. So this is going to tell us, the study of these handbooks, a lot about the practice of astrology in the context of these temples of the Greco-Roman period. In these two places, the dump and the Tebtunis temple library, we have not just text in Demotic, but also text in Greek. And actually, we are about to publish a set of new astronomical tables, both in Greek and in Demotic from Tebtunis. This is an almost finished project with Alexander Jones and also Kim Ryholt and Joachim Quack. And these are very interesting tables because you find the same formats in both languages. So this was a fully bilingual community. We have no horoscopes from Tebtunis if we don't consider those softies, because those are particular. But horoscopes were normally written on ostracos, so they might be waiting somewhere in the site. And just to summarize about the transmission of all this knowledge, the earliest period would be the Ptolemaic period. Cumon and Festugier were already talking about that date for the composition, and now we have one handbook that dates to this period. So we do have that oldest material. Then there was an internal transmission within the Egyptian temples. We see that we have variations within the Egyptian manual. So they were already compiling, summarizing within that Egyptian language context. Ling Xin has discovered an example of abbreviation in those handbooks for women. The lack of physiognomies in 66 points also to that abbreviation. And with other texts in the Tebtunis Temple Library, we also see this in the Book of Nut, which is preserved in 6 papyri in the library. We also see this phenomenon. At some point, these handbooks were translated into Greek, and we have examples of other texts for which we have Greek translations, like the myth of the Sun Sai. And this is in the context of this bilingual practice. And Hephaistion accessed those Greek translations. Hephaistion was not reading the Demotic. He was working already from a Greek translation of the text. And then the last step is the one that has come down to us, which are the Byzantine manuscripts. So the oldest, as I said, 11th century, 13th century for the main text, 14 for the epitomes. And thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Marina. That was absolutely fascinating, and it's always thrilling for me as a historian of Greek literature to meet with people who are working on Egypt, because there's so much new material. It's just it's absolutely amazing. So our knowledge seems to be changing month by month, and it's really lovely to get a detailed report from the front lines. Yeah, so we have about I think about a little over 10 minutes for discussion. For those of you who are obviously, for those of you who are in the room, we have microphones which we'll pass around. For those of you who are attending online, it's probably easiest actually if you ask your question directly to us. So with but if you can't, then you can put them in the chat. So yes, I'll open the floor for discussion of Maria's paper. Yeah, we have a question online from Marie. Can the astronomical ancient skies be matched up with the claims of the piece C66 variations?
Oh, I mean, we can map how they conceived of the sky. We still, and Joachim will talk more about the decans. We still don't know exactly what all the decans correspond to in terms of stars. The decans can be a single star, a group of stars, a whole constellation. It's really hard to tell. Some of them are clear, like Sothis, but then it's others is not that clear. And also because at this point we are mapping the decans into this framework of the zodiac, but in ancient times this was different. It's the same as the zodiacal constellations in Mesopotamia. Originally they had different lengths. They were not just a fixed framework. In terms of the predictions that we get, I mean, that's something they came up with in antiquity. It's not based on something objective like the astronomical information. What we can do is to test the how accurate the astronomical tables are. And in that case, they're actually pretty accurate. The kind of astronomy that was done at this time was mathematical. It was not based on observation. Everything was calculated based on algorithms that came in most cases from Mesopotamia. Part of it was developed later in Hellenistic Egypt, but a lot of it comes from these algorithms that were borrowed from Mesopotamia and adapted. They're not just taken without reasoning. You can see that they understand how you come up with these calculations, and they give more detail than you would actually be able to even verify. In some tables you have up to 2 sexagesimal numbers in the longitude. So you know, that's a lot of precision. We can also tell that it's calculated because some of the positions that they give you are happening during the day, so you wouldn't be able to see it. So in those terms, we can match with what would be happening in the sky. We can calculate the positions and match them with what appears in the tables. In terms of the astrological handbooks, obviously, a lot of what is done in later astrology derives from these handbooks, but there's not a direct correspondence in everything. This is something that we want to see in this project, to look in detail how much is transmitted exactly and how much is elaborated later on. I don't know if I have answered the question.
Yes, thank you. And we have another question, I think, from the same person. Is there any evidence of who primarily copied Hephaestion of Thebes? From early in the 5th century author Hephaestion of Thebes, from early copies to the 11th and 14th century CE. So I think she's asking about what the intermediate tradition would have been, those Greek letters on your stemma.
We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the case with most of these manuscripts. It's a long line of transmission. Even in antiquity, we think of the transmission of papyri, a papyrus that is constantly used, and these handbooks presumably wouldn't last more than 100 years. So you would need to keep recopying these handbooks. In some cases, like in the magical formularies, you see evidence of repair, that they were patching the handbooks because once you use them so much, they start to break. And in each copy, you can introduce errors. These are hand copies. So in that long transmission from the 5th century to the 11th to 14th century, you have not just the copy of the text, but you have translations. You have different contexts in which these texts are being understood. Depending on which copies they're using, they're already working with abbreviated copies. So it's a complicated history, and we don't know the names of the anonymous. They're basically anonymous scribes in those cases. In the case of Egypt, there are these attributions to these sages of antiquity, but one of the things that we have also in literature is that we don't know the names of the authors. We don't have names for who composed, you know, Setna or the Inara cycle. So it's a different context. Yeah.
I suppose even within the Greek tradition, I suppose, well, obviously there are manuscript writers like Ptolemy who have a sort of massive manuscript tradition, but then I suppose you're dealing to some extent with a kind of open open tradition designed for use, where authorship becomes a much more sort of flexible
Yeah.
concept, doesn't it?
Yeah, and in some cases we can attribute who composed it, but there's this pseudo-epigraphic tradition in which it is better if you market your handbook as written by someone famous than if you are a no one and it's like, who's going to buy this? It's just like the German astrologers. Like Gottfried was not going to be very successful, but if he's the wife of Ptolemy, then that's more attractive. So yeah, that hasn't changed that much.
No. We have a question from Lasso Levente. Levente, do you want?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's very nice. Okay. Hi, Peter.
Hi.
And hi, Marina. I really like this fantastic talk. So it was really great, and I'm looking forward to seeing the publication of these very, very interesting sources. I would have a few remarks to the manuscripts and to the sources of Hephaistion, because you used Pingree stemma from his critical edition. And you also referred to the so-called epitome 4 for a couple of times. I just want to say that it looks like this earliest manuscript that is from the 11th century with the sigil L. Also contains an epitome from the text. So and this epitome seems to be closer to the other epitomes than to the main manuscripts A and P. So I don't think that it should be trusted fully in this case. So I also know that there is an Italian philologist, Alberti, who criticized Pingree's stemma in his book, and he said that this L is much closer to these epitomes than to the main text. And the other thing is that this epitome 4 has a prototype. So it is contained in a couple of manuscripts, but the prototype seems to be the one that is this manuscript I. So this Laurentianus 2813, and it was autographed by Isaac Argyros in the 1370s, and he revised many astrological texts and philosophical texts and other types of texts, and it looks like he like to change the content very much. So there's a reason why his epitome 4 can be useful to clarify some philological details sometimes, but his testimony should not be trusted at all in this case. So I just want to highlight it because he said that, oh, some things are missing from epitome 4, but there are some signs that they might have been there originally. Now, it looks like they were there originally. The only thing is that Isaac Argyros did a very good work in his revisions. Okay, so I just want to highlight this because the Hephaistion textual tradition is terrible, but there are some pitfalls if one believes that these epitomes can help a lot. So that's it. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much.
Really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that we want to do, we're using at the moment Pingree's edition, but we want to look at the manuscripts because perhaps the Demotic handbooks might help us elucidate some of these parts that are missing, or parts that are closer in the way they appear in the main text, in the epitomes. One of the interesting things was that remark of Neugebauer on the symbol. So that's again a remnant of the earlier tradition. So what we don't want to do is to completely discard any of the manuscripts in case they preserve something that might have been considered as coming from outside of the tradition, but actually might reflect something that was in the earlier manuscripts. So that's one side of the project that might help us with dealing with also some of the editorial decisions that Pingree made in his edition.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes left. Do we have any? Yes, Fabio.
Yes. Just I was thinking before this passage with status and not enjoying sexual life. If could be also.
Sorry, that might allow you to speak online as well.
or
Maybe if you speak into the microphone.
yes.
You don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking if with Taurus and sex life, if this is also linked with the characteristic of the zodiacal sign itself, because we know that Taurus is described as Telukos, is described as being a female and not a male, and also in iconography it's never represented with the genitalia because it's considered a castrated sign. So I was thinking if this can also motivate this kind of prognostication based on the actual characteristic of the zodiacal sign itself.
We haven't looked into that yet, but that's another part that we want to explore once we have compiled all the predictions in all the handbooks. As I said, now there are 6 handbooks of this kind identified, and they are not the same, all of them. So we also want to see if there's some features, even if there are variations, if there's some features that repeat that might lead us about how they were conceiving the signs, and if it is different from what we know from the later tradition. But again, we haven't done this work yet. But yeah, that's something that we really want to explore. It could be, definitely. Thank you.